Good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying that relative change in the weather. It's a little bit less hot outside, which is nicer. For today's background, I want to thank Mr. Timothy for sending the picture. It allows me to not spend time looking for pictures myself, which I appreciate that. Let's start. All right. Today we'll complete the discussion about political psychology and the individual levels of levels of analysis. So, as usual, let's talk a little bit about what was the last lecture on Tuesday. So I started talking about political psychology, the individual level of analysis, some of the motivations for research in that area, some of the recent trends in terms of the different methodologies that are adopted by these kinds of scholars, the areas that are studied, which are a little bit different from other areas of research. Then we spend a lot of time talking about prospect theory, one of the foundations of political psychology, different concepts such as reference dependence, how that translates to the way we view every decision in terms of gains and losses, the concepts of loss aversion, how that affects our behavior in terms of risky choices. I talked about the example of former Egyptian President Sadat in 1973. He viewed the loss of the Sinai Peninsula in 1967 as a loss, so he was willing to take the risk and go to war in 1973, even though he knew the odds are not really in his favor. And then I talked about the idea of framing and the way that every decision we make is also based on how the information that we face or the option that we have to choose from are framed, and that with the context of the Asian disease, whether it is framed as a win or as a loss, is going to matter a lot for what kind of decision we're going to make. And then we shifted away from prospect theory into other issues in political psychology, first with emotions, how those feelings of anger or fear impact our choices and our preferred policies in the context of international relations. I talked about different heuristics led by the availability heuristic and how that might lead to misperceptions of information and choices which are less than ideal, suboptimal on some levels. And I ended up talking about the main limitations of that research area, focusing on the aggregation problem. How do we go from the individual in the opinion of one person or a group of people into the opinion of everyone to a much larger scale? And then the idea of external validity. How do we generalize the findings from one or two specific samples into elites or to the general population as a whole? If you have any questions about this topic, you, as always, welcome to email me or come talk to me about it. Virtually come talk to me about it during office hours. So I made a long introduction on Tuesday talking about the psychological approach, focuses on studying individuals. And now I want to shift the discussion to talk about specific individuals in the context of IR, which is leaders and elites. So the first question is why? Why should we study those individuals specifically? Despite the presence of leaders in world politics, there is relatively not a lot of theoretical work about how those specific leaders shape events. Some of the questions that are addressed over the last couple of years as this research area has been expanded is how does the background experiences of leaders will influence their decision-making once they're in office? How does their beliefs influence how they perceive the behavior and the intentions of others? And what is the relationship between leadership turnover and behavior in the international system, such as conflict behavior? So that's one way to answer those questions of why do we want to study those kinds of leaders. Let's talk about some of the origins of that research. Some suggest that it goes back all the way to Morgenthau's work on realism. He did not argue that we should use individuals or individual decision makers as the unit of analysis, but he did emphasize that the quality of diplomacy, which in essence is defined by the individuals that engage in that diplomacy, is the most important factor in the international system, because diplomacy leads to the various configurations of the balance of power, which again, according to realism, was the most important aspect. But that diplomacy, if we go a little bit further down the levels of analysis, is shaped by those who formulate that. So that's some background. A lot of the early work focused on specific leaders and their different psychological aspects, such as their personality, their life experiences, their beliefs. And the decline in that research in the latter stages in the second half of the 20th century has been relatively mostly due to the rise of structural theories led by neorealism, the assumption of a unitary actor, which does not place any value on differences between individuals, and the focus on the system in theories of IR. One more limitations that also contributed to that decline is the lack of data, or what kind of method we want to use in order to actually test empirically some of those theories. Because as I said, a lot of the early work on specifically on leaders focused on cases of specific leaders and testing those leaders. So there's a problem in terms of generalizing those findings to a more general argument about political leaders, elites, and how that shapes international relations. Over the last 15 years, there's been a lot more work focusing on that. It uses all kinds of advances in data collections with large data sets with specific characteristics of leaders. I'll talk about that. Another method that has became more popular over the last 10 years or so is conducting survey experiments using elite samples. That provides us two clear benefits. The first is we can study the behavior of elites with the same instruments or the same tools that we use to study the public. So again, using elite samples with experiments or surveys, just like we do for the public, which is useful in that case. But even more important than that, it allows researchers to use the same theoretical frameworks which we use to study the public, also to test them on elites, which accounts for a lot of concerns that we have, as I talked about the limitations on the previous lecture on external validity. Because if I argue that leaders are likely to behave on some way during conflict and my test is only on the public, then there is concerns about external validity. If I can apply that same framework with an elite sample of decision makers, then those concerns should be reduced. However, there's of course challenges in this case. The first is in terms of how many elites can we actually get. It's much harder to recruit large samples of top decision makers. So if the main cost for recruiting 1,000 members of the public to run an experiment is money, it's a lot harder to do and to recruit 1,000 members of the 1,000 decision makers in this case. Sometimes some scholars use military officers, junior military officers, which fit like on the verge of what can be viewed as elite decision makers. Others have used former politicians, which is a better fit in terms of people that actually were in those positions, but that leads to the second challenge in this case, which is the context. It's much harder to present real-world example of foreign policy scenarios and actually get honest answers, because some of those elites might have incentives to behave in a strategic manner. So if we're talking about former politicians, they may give us an answer of what they should have done and not what they actually did. So that's some of the challenges in these kinds of areas. Overall, there are two general views on the research of leaders. The first suggests that leaders matter, but external factors are much more powerful. And the alternative approach provides more room and more agency for the leaders themselves and their own characteristics and preferences in shaping international events. So let's talk a little bit more details about those two approaches. They fit to what's called two schools of thought. And the first, and this discussion is based on what you had in your first paper for today's reading. The institutional leadership school is more of a situation based category. According to this argument, according to this approach, leaders have a certain amount of agency and can have effect on events, but at the same time, they are highly constrained by both domestic and international conditions that make their ability to have clear effect on the outcomes very restricted on some level. This is an argument that is closer relatively to the realist school of thought, or the neo-realist in this case, placing a lot more emphasis on the structure itself than the leader. But at the same time, researchers that do follow this school of thought do place more weight on the individual leader and her circumstances as shaping some of those events. One of the central topics that are studied within this school is what's called leadership turnover. How does a change in leadership affect world politics? And if we want to understand why should we study those kinds of topics, we have to think about it in the context of how other leaders are perceiving the new boss entering into office. When a new leader comes into play, then the existing leaders in other countries should try and think about, they face a lot more uncertainty in trying to figure out what type of leader it is. If we think about it from a rational or a strategic perspective, whether this is someone who cares a lot about resolve, how likely this leader it is to behave in a very resolved manner, how much does reputation matter? Will some actions be more likely early on when that leader enters into office or later on? This is why we should care about turnover. As an example, some studies have suggested that when former Soviet Premier Khrushchev instigated the 1961 crisis in Berlin, was in part intended to test the degree of resolve that the new leader, the new American leader, in this case JFK, will display. So that's part of the idea of why do we study these kinds of cases. A lot of those studies are based on large data sets, which have information about tenure of leaders and their time in office, and that can be linked to international events. One example for that is what's called the Archegos data set. It was introduced in 2009, if I remember correctly. I've made some, like screenshots of the way that this data set looks like. That's how the data looks. It has over 2,000 observations, as far as I remember. So there's columns for whatever country that is, the president itself. We have information about when this president entered office, when that president left office, the way that the president entered and exited from office. In this case, we have here, this was from the days that Obama was still in office. So you can see that he's still in office. We have a natural death for former Canadian Prime Minister Thompson, which died while he was in office. Also information about more individual specific information, such as gender, the years that the leader was born and died, and other kinds of information. So this is the type of attributes and characteristics that those kinds of data sets provide us and allow us to test a lot of questions, which are more focusing on the individual level of analysis. All right, so the second school of thought here is called the leader attribute school. In this studies in this category place a lot more emphasis on the beliefs, the attitudes, and the past experiences of leaders as shaping the political outcomes. It accounts for factors both in the individual characteristics level, such as the age or the gender of the leader, as you saw in the data set. On the other hand, there's other factors in this case which are more focusing on the life experience, such as what type of education, how many years of education, whether that leader had experience in the military or as a rebel. All those arguments matter and are part of the analysis in these studies. Many of these studies in this school of thought focus on how leader and whether there are different characteristics of individual leaders and how that matters for the effect on the public. So for example, a study from 2018 suggested that leaders want to test or to change or to affect the public support for different policies. And for that, we have to also look at other members of the elites, and that's the presidential advisors. The basic premise of that paper is that when the members of the public form their opinion on different foreign policy options, they look for information from elites, what's called elite cues. And in this case, presidential advisors or government advisors matter a lot because they are viewed as experts on those matters. And the public is mostly focusing on situations where the opinion of the advisor is different from the behavior of the leader. So if a leader decides to use force and then one of his advisors comes against the use of force, then it's more likely that the public support for the use of force will decline. But where does the individual level factors matter? So one of the arguments from that specific paper was the type of the advisor influences this process. So if the advisor is a dove or a hawk in terms of support for the use of force matters. And the effect of the statement by the advisor are more likely to be more powerful when they are a counter to the type. So in this case, if advisor who's viewed as a hawkish advisor comes out against the use of force, it's more likely to be more powerful than an advisor who's viewed as a dove and talks against the use of force. So this is where some of those factors can come into play. Another important individual level factor that is studied by some of those researchers is beliefs. The beliefs of leaders matter a lot for deterrence theory. I talked about it, if you remember, on realism, the way that I view the level of resolve that another leader is going to behave. It's going to matter for how much he's going to be deterred by my actions. So this is a little bit about this is a study that used what I termed one of the new methods of collecting data and testing, empirical testing of some of those theories using elite surveys. So this is a survey of former members of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. The paper came up in 2018. And I'll show you some of this is one of the results that they had. What they want to test is how elites perceive signals by their adversaries and how credible they see those signals. So for example, they found that one of the central predictors of viewing the credibility of that signal from their adversary is the leader's orientation. So you can view here, it's actually pretty small, but it says here military assertiveness. And that represents how hawkish is the elite. Those who are more hawkish leaders are less likely to view public threats by their adversaries as credible. This is why you can see the effect here is negative. Those who are high on military assertiveness, so they are hawkish, they view public threats as less credible. At the same time, those same individuals view very positively the effect of mobilizing troops. So that's just one example without going into details on the study itself, how the data was collected, but just showing you how those individual level characteristics matter and how they are collected within those kinds of studies. For that matter also other individual level effects in this case, such as having experience in combat, in the case of the Israeli sample, did not matter. As you can see, both of them are centered around the 0. So there's actually no effect, even though we have to remember that in the Israeli context, testing for combat experience is a little bit problematic because all citizens are required to join the army. So practically almost every Israeli citizen, especially the ones who are relatively older today, has military experience. And in terms of how do we define combat experience, that's very dependent on the case. So we have to put this kind of a caveat on the side, but still the point was not to focus on the combat experience, but to show how those individual characteristics matter for those kinds of studies. Okay, one of the central implications that this study that I talked about and others that are focusing on the individual leaders show us is that those attributes, leader-specific attributes, are important for the way that those elites interpret information, and therefore that shapes their behavior in the international context. It also provides us a little bit more information that we can then identify variations. If you remember when I started talking about last week about on Tuesday, I'm sorry, about why do we study the individual level of analysis, one of the benefits of the individual level of analysis was to explain variations in outcomes when most of the structural and domestic conditions are similar. So in this case, if we have two cases of the only difference is that there's two different leaders, but they view the same type of information and the same type of situation overall, and the outcomes are different, we can use those variations between the individuals to explain those outcomes. And that's one of the benefits of those kinds of studies. Okay, I want to shift now and talk some of the studies that some of them you had on the reading list, some of them you didn't. Those studies leverage the individual level factor and the focus on those kinds of factors to explain behavior in the international context. The first I want to talk about is the Herman paper that you had on your reading list. So Professor Herman is one of the first to study those kinds of questions. She's a professor in Syracuse today, and her work was one of the first that focused on a systematic analysis of leader attributes in order to explain decisions in foreign policy or in the international context. She explores the questions of how different personality traits matter for those kinds of choices. And if you wonder why should we care about personality traits, then her argument in this case is that she identifies several traits which are very important in shaping what she calls different foreign policy orientations. So she identifies several characteristics which lead to the creation of two orientations. One is what she termed independent orientation, which fits with leaders who tend to behave in a more aggressive manner in foreign affairs. The other is the participatory orientation, which fits better with a more conciliatory type leader and those kinds of behavior. And one of the, another important point that she mentions is that those individuals' personality characteristics tend to interact and are conditional upon two other factors, which is the level of interest that the leader has in foreign policy and the extent of training. The more interest the leader has in foreign policy, it tends to emphasize the effects of those personality traits. The more training, it actually tends to reduce the effects of the personality because the leader is more experienced in, we can call it how the sausage is made. The leader knows how foreign policy is being implemented, so the individual effects are less powerful. So, Herman defines 4 broad types of characteristics that fit into those 2 different orientations. So she talks about beliefs, which are fundamental assumptions of the individual has about the world in terms of interpretation of the environment and what are the preferred actions. So 2 of the central characteristics in this context are degree of nationalism and the belief in the ability to control events. She also talks about motives, which are the reasons for the behavior that we observe by those leaders, and it can be tested with indicators such as the need for power or the need for affiliation. Decision style related to the preferred method of making decisions. More complex settings, more easy settings. Some individuals prefer to make a more centralized kind of decision-making style. Others prefer a more participatory one. All of them are related to those orientations. And the last one is what's called the interpersonal style. And that's how decision makers tend to deal with others. And the focus that she offers is on the degree of trust or distrust in other individuals. Now, those characteristics can be used to form specific personal classification, but her main objective, of course, is to describe a systematic framework that uses those specific characteristics in order to describe the ways that leaders are going to behave. So, for example, when we think about decision style, some are preferring more centralized style in which the foreign policy is managed from the office of the president or the prime minister, whatever the leader. Others tend to be more open in their decision style and foreign policy and allow much more room for the bureaucratic process in implementing and shaping policy. So this is just one example. How do we take one of those characteristics and we generalize them to a more to provide a more systematic measure to test the behavior. In terms of the methodology, so she does a content analysis of leaders' interactions with the press in the relevant affairs, international affairs. This is the time frame that she uses, the 1960s mostly, and she's focusing on what's called spontaneous interactions of leaders with the press, because she wants to avoid from the pre-written speeches and letters, which are written on some way, and she wants to focus on the more spontaneous interactions, which are better reflection of the leader's attitude, because we're looking here at very personal characteristics of those leaders. And the way that it works is that she uses a basic coding scheme, which is a very the origins of studying what's called text analysis today, and that's seeking the occurrence of different words or different terms in her data and better fit with the definition. So I guess, as an example, if we want to measure nationalism in the data that she uses, so she looks for terminology which reflects viewing the nation of the leader as taking a center stage in events, words that display strong emotional ties to the nation, or leaders that talk about very passionately about honor or identity. Those kinds of words are a reflection of high degree of nationalism. So what does she find? Some of the results. So she tested different types of behaviors in the context of foreign policy, of course. So one is, for example, is the orientation to change, the acceptance of change. That's how the government sets different goals and how does it look for different policy options to accomplish those goals, or does the government prefer to just rely on status quo? In terms of the findings, those are based on mostly on correlations between those different factors and the different individual factors, along with the training and the interest in foreign policy. And for example, she finds that high degree of nationalism and high degree of need of power tend to have negative correlations with accepting change, and more so that those leaders who are high on those traits are more likely to prefer the status quo. And that's even more powerful when it's combined with low interest in foreign policy as well as high training. She also tests independence or interdependence, reminding you interdependence. I talked about this a little bit in liberalism. We'll talk about it a lot more next week. And those who are high on independent orientation or have high training are more likely to follow the independent type of action. She tests a few questions. She tests a few questions about affect, and that's the degree of friendliness or hostility to the behavior of other nations. And for that, I actually put the results here. It's a little small, I'm sorry about that, but that's from the paper. What you can see here is the correlation table between the different personal characteristics along with the factors of interest and training. And for example, what we see in this case, this is related to the questions of affect towards others. We see a very strong negative correlation between strong need for power along with low interest in foreign policy has negative correlations with affect. So those are less likely to display high degrees of affect towards to others, to the behavior of others in foreign policy. This is just one example for that. She also addresses feedback from the environment, showing that those who tends to have more participatory orientations tend to be more open to feedback from the environment. Overall, one of the important implications of her study, and that's also very important for future work because her study was published in the 1980s, and that was very powerful for work that we see over the last 10 years or so, is the role that experience, as the way that she views that, is training, and how having little experience or little training increases the likelihood that all kinds of individual dispositions or personality traits will play a larger role in the behavior of individuals. So that's Herman's work, one of the originals in this case. And I want to move on to talk about another individual characteristic, and this time focusing on experience. That's why I ended the Herman one with experience, and shaping behavior in a conflict setting. And I want to talk about research by Horowitz and Stamm. The main puzzle that they want to explore is how does past life experiences matter for behavior of leaders in international affairs, especially in the context of a conflict. They rely on work from psychology as the foundations for their work. This work suggests that past events in life tend to serve as heuristics or frames of reference and impact our evaluations of costs and benefits when we make decisions and select different ways to address all kinds of decision tasks. So past experience matter for the way that we behave now. And they're focusing on experience in the military. And in their context, it's important, especially in terms of the risk attitudes or the risk orientations of those individual leaders. The extent of experience that an individual has in the military matters for their risk profile and the different ways that they view the use of force. So they discussed 3 types of experience in that context. The first is what's called military, and that's having just military experience. Those with such background tend to view the use of military as the most effective solutions to political problems. So they tend to display higher degree of accepting risks. On the other hand, those who have combat experience, so they have military experience, but they also have combat experience. Those who experience combat are more conservative when it comes to the use of force, mostly because they know about the potential ramification and costs of using force. So those who have combat experience in terms of their risk orientations actually tend to be more risk averse. The third types of experience that they account for in this case is experience as being part of a rebel group. This is military experience outside the confines of a nation state. And the logic for that is being a member of rebel forces represents a substantial risk for that individual, because being a member in a rebellion is a direct threat to the state and the likelihood of winning is not very high. The bottom line is that those who have experience in rebel organizations tend to be more risk accepting. And just to make sure that you understand that those kinds of different experiences matter overall, this is from their paper that shows the extent of experience, those 3 different experiences that leaders have over 100 years, the percentage of leaders that display those kinds of experiences, especially at the latter part of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, was very, very high. When you can think about the rebel experiences, over 30% of leaders in the 1940s. So because a lot of the leaders have that experience, that's important to test how those kinds of characteristics may affect their behavior. So this is the model that they adopt. It combines the effects of the individual characteristics, the experience, military, combat, and rebel experience, along with different political institutions. So those experiences work actually in conjunction with the different political institutions that affect the selection of leaders into office. For example, in this case, we can think about military regimes, non-democratic military regimes. The leaders in those kinds of regimes tend to be much more aggressive and accept risk, because their way into power, the way that those kinds of regimes actually allow people to get into power positions, compels them to use force and take a lot of risks. So that's how the combination of those factors, and that's what you see here in this figure that displays the model. We have the life experiences which shape the beliefs and the attitudes of the leaders, especially in the context of risk, according to the argument that they proposed. You should also account for the domestic politics, which matters here. That's where the interaction of those factors come into play, and that shapes the final outcomes. Okay, so this is one of their main findings. In terms of the methods, so they rely on a large data set. It's over 2,500 individual leaders from the late 19th century till 2004. And their data set, it's called the lead data set, accounts for having military or combat experience as separate factors. So you can have factor which accounts for how much military experience you have. We have a different factor which accounts for how much combat experience an individual has, also of course for rebel in this case. So this is one of their main findings that shows how those different factors affect the probability of initiating conflict. What we see here is that just based on their predictions, having military service in this case and having also rebel experience, as well as having military experience with no combat experience, all those lead to higher propensity to initiate conflict compared to those who have combat experience, those who have no rebel experience, or those who have none of those experiences at all. So again, based on their predictions for how military or combat experience translate to different or reflect different risk preferences, that affects the probability of initiating conflict in this case. Now, if you remember, of course you remember, I just talked about it 2 minutes ago, the argument is that those individual characteristics are not the only thing that matters, but those individual characteristics interact or work combined with the political institutions. So this is the finding that they have. In this case, they're testing how having military experience and combat experience, or military experience and no combat experience, affect the probability of initiating conflict for different types of regimes. So that's what they have here on the x-axis. You can see those numbers between -10 and 10. Those are different measures for regime type based on one of the main databases of regime types called the polity. The polity provides different scores for the type of regime based on different factors. I'm not going to go into that, but overall, every regime which has a score above 7 is a democracy. So the United States is 10, Great Britain is 10, Israel is 10, and those countries between the score of 6 or 7 and -6 or 7 are countries which are in between. They're not democracies and they're not complete dictatorships. And all the countries that have score of lower than -6 are what we view as the autocracies of the world, North Korea, for example. So essentially what we see in this figure is the combined effect of individual characteristics in terms of military and combat experience along with the type of regime. Now, the line here represents the effect of having both military and combat experience, and the line here, the almost horizontal line, is the just military effects, not combat experience. The dashed marks represent the confidence interval. So what we have to focus on is where those two paths of results actually are separate from one another, because once those diverge, as in here, you see those two confidence intervals overlap, then there's no difference between those two factors. But starting from here, which is somewhere around -2 in terms of the regime type score, there's a difference between those two levels or those two values. What we see here, this represents, as I said, the combat experience. Those who have combat experience, those who does not have combat experience, I'm sorry, that's the values here, and are within a regime, within a dictatorship, I'm sorry, are more likely to initiate conflict compared to those that do have combat experience. So again, this is the effect of risk orientations as expressed by past military and combat experience, along with along with the institutional setting, in this case, the regime type. Overall, what this study demonstrates is an important linkage between background military experience and the propensity of leaders to initiate conflicts when they enter office. This past background is important because it presents to us important information about some of the behavioral tendencies and the beliefs of those leaders, especially in the context of how they view the use of force as a central tool to address a political dispute or political challenges. Now, a lot of the research on leader attributes actually focuses on conflict behavior. I want to talk about a different type of aspect of international politics, and that's military alliances. The question that is studied here is actually a pretty contemporary topic. How much do different leaders contribute to military alliances? How much do we see the phenomena of free riding, which I'll talk in a second? The main idea, the main question in this case is the extent of contribution of different leaders based on their individual characteristics to large, powerful military alliances. And we think about that in the context of the author of this study, formulates this by describing military alliances, such as NATO in this case, as what's called the public good. And let's talk about that. Public good is a type of product or an outcome that members of the public can get from the government. And the idea behind the public good is it doesn't matter how much or how many more individuals contribute to the public good, everyone still get the same amount of that good. As an example, think about national security. It doesn't matter if I'm paying more taxes than any one of you, we both get the same amount of national security. It doesn't matter if I was a member of the military and two other members of you were members of the military and others were not members of the military. It doesn't matter how much we contribute to the good, we all get the same amount. We all get the same level of national security, regardless of how much do we contribute to that. That's a public good. The opposite of that, just in terms of to have the complete pictures of those terminologies, is a private good, which you get, how much you get of that good is a function of how much you contribute. So, how can we think about military alliance as a public good? Again, in the context of NATO. The idea behind that is that all the members of the NATO military alliance benefit the same amount from the charter. According to the NATO charter, an attack against one member of the alliance should be viewed as an attack against all members of the alliance. So every member of the alliance that is facing an attack should be able to secure the support and the military power of other members of the alliance. Why should we view that as a public good? Because it doesn't matter if there is an additional new members that join the alliances, all of the other members of the alliance should still get the same amount of defense. This is the product we're talking about here, right? This is how NATO fits into a public good. Whether the alliance only consists of the United States and Great Britain and Canada and Belgium, for example, all the members of that alliance get the same amount of defense, even after we add in Greece and Hungary and Iceland, for example, right? Now, the idea of free riding, that's the second concept we have to think about here, is the possibility that in strong military alliance settings such as NATO, some of the weaker members may free ride because the alliance is backed by a strong nuclear power. The idea is that those weak members, let's take Iceland for example again, will not contribute as much as we may think Iceland should contribute in order to get the same degree of defense such as the United States. So the United States contributes a lot more to NATO than Iceland, but both of them gets the same amount of defense. That's the idea of free riding. So Iceland, for example, okay, is the free rider in this case. Okay. Again, the idea is that those weaker actors tend to get the same benefits of deterrence or defense from a strong military alliance, which is backed by countries such as the United States, without contributing as much to the same good. That's the idea of free riding on a public good in the context of NATO. Before I finish up with the last slide for today, I'll stop for a minute for the attendance word. Today's attendance word is white, like the color. And I also urge you to not shut down the video just yet. Stay for the end. I want to give you a few pointers about the midterm test. So just a few more minutes. All right, so we're talking about military alliances as a public good and the problem of free riding and how does individual leader characteristics matter for this entire puzzle of issues. So this is a study by Professor Furman, actually one of the professors here in our department, who just came out, the study just was published over the last couple of months. The main argument that he focuses on is on experience of leaders and their behavior in the context of military alliances. the individual characteristics that he's focusing on is business experience at the executive level before going into office. And the main argument that he proposes is that those leaders that have such experience, they had executive level experience in the business world before going into office, are likely to make smaller contributions to military alliances. And those contributions are measured in the context of defense expenditures, how much they are investing in the defense that goes into the alliance as a whole. The reasons for that are two individual level explanations, actually. The first is those kinds of leaders tend to display more behavioral tendencies that are more egoistic. Because growing up in the corporate world, the socialization process of becoming a corporate executive tends to emphasize for those individuals their own financial interests. You only get to a position of top executive in those kinds of firms by emphasizing your own financial interests. Also, many of those individuals have a very firm belief in their self-efficacy and their own power, and that leads them to view themselves as very capable in getting what they want without paying as much. As again, in the context of military alliances, those kinds of leaders will believe that they're able to get what they can from the military alliance without paying much. So they're not going to have to contribute a lot to the alliances, to NATO as an example, but they will still get all the benefits from that. The study focuses on explaining variations in the extent of contribution of NATO members to the alliance. So some contribute more, some contribute little, and we want to understand how that is a function of the leader experience in the corporate world. The author tests that theory by analyzing the defense budgets of 17 NATO allies without the United States in the second half of the 20th century, 1952 to 2014, actually. In terms of the results, so his main results support his proposition. Having business experience tend to reduce the extent of contribution to the alliance. In this case, it's having business experience leads those individuals to reduce the extent of growth that they provide to the investment in defense in the alliance every year. So in this case, every year, every country has to invest some of its own budget in NATO in this case. So according to his findings, having business experience tend to reduce that growth in over 1% in the following year. And those kinds of lower investment are even bigger for the large European countries such as the United Kingdom and Britain and France. And that's just another study that shows us how those kinds of individual level characteristics, which reflect individual traits, how they translate into behavior in the international context, in this case, military organizations, military alliances such as NATO. All right, if you want to read a little bit more about leaders and IR behavior, then those ladies has provided us with some very interesting studies. And the work by Professor Lupton talks about having military experience and how those individuals vote and behave in Congress. And the work by Professor Barnes and O'Brien focus on the gender, the individual characteristics of gender and how that affects the appointment of defense ministers across the world. So all those are very interesting papers, which if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend you to read. All right, final points as I promised about the midterm task. So how do we submit that? I said that on the lecture a couple of weeks ago when I talked about it. I have already opened an assignment on eCampus, so you should get already a notification about the place to submit your task. I would encourage you to attach a document, whether it is a Word file or a PDF file, whatever it is easier for you to write, and just attach that when you submit your assignment. Do not just write it down in the assignment response. I prefer that, but again, whatever it's easier for you. If there are any problems with those issues on eCampus, please let me know. So I'll be able to fix any problem. You will have the option to submit your assignment on time. The deadline, I remind you again, is on Friday, next Friday, October 2nd at midnight. Make sure you send it by then. Don't send it to me on Saturday morning and then send me an email on Saturday noon telling me, I'm sorry, I did not send it on time because of ABC. I'm not going to be too open to that. If there are any problems and you have any reason not to submit on time, please let me know beforehand. Finally, I got some questions about this task, both on email and some of the students that came on office hours, so I'll address them. I do ask you to include references to other academic work or media links that you use for this task. Make sure that you follow whatever method you use, whether it is Chicago or an APA, whatever reference method you prefer, just make sure you are consistent and you use the same method for the entire paper for all the references. And in terms of format, again, I talked about it, anywhere between 2 to 2.5 pages. Size of the font should be 12, double spaced, everything that you do in other papers that you, in other projects that you have to submit while you're here in A&M. And if you have, of course, any other questions, please send them to me by email. Come join us on office hours. It's really not a problem. Just come join the Zoom hours whenever the hour is, and we can talk about it. I promise I won't keep you here more than you need for your own questions. That's it. That's what I have for today. I hope you'll have a nice weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. Bye, everyone.